Our beloved friends, we begin today with the radiant truth that our God is sovereignly and lovingly at work in the lives of his children. Every thread of our existence, from our highest triumphs to our lowest despairs, is woven by his divine hand into a tapestry of good for those who love him. This is not mere conjecture, but the immutable promise of Romans 8:28, where the Apostle Paul declares, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." Herein lies the marrow of our discussion. How does the unseen hand of God orchestrate the seemingly discordant notes of life into a symphony of his glory and our good? To answer this, we turn to the remarkable story of David, a young shepherd boy turned warrior, poet, and king. His life is an anthem of divine favor, showing us how God turns the wilderness into a proving ground, the battlefield into a place of victory, and the throne room into a platform for his purpose. Consider, dear listeners, how this resonates with the heart's deepest struggles in our age. In a world where so many feel unseen, undervalued, or trapped in obscurity, David's story is a clarion call to hope. It reminds us that the God who called him from tending sheep to ruling a nation is the same God who sees you, loves you, and is working all things for your ultimate good. How often do we stand in the midst of life's storms, unable to perceive the greater picture? Yet it is in these moments that we are called to trust that the architect of eternity is shaping our story with meticulous care. Today, we will explore 4 pivotal moments in David's life that illuminate how God's orchestration works in our own. His selection in the wilderness, his entrance into Saul's house, his victory over Goliath, and his ascension to the throne. Through each, we will see the favor of God at work, and we will learn to trust his orchestration in our lives. Shall we journey together into the heart of this magnificent tale? Let us uncover the unfathomable depths of God's providence. Let us begin, dear friends, where David's story first catches our attention, not in a palace or a grand hall, but in the humble fields of Bethlehem. The prophet Samuel was sent by God to anoint one of Jesse's sons as the next king of Israel. Yet when Jesse gathered his sons, David was not among them. He was left to tend the sheep, overlooked even by his own family. Consider this. The prophet of God stands ready to anoint a king, yet David, the one chosen by heaven, is not even invited to the gathering. How familiar this feels in our own lives. Perhaps you too have felt forgotten, bypassed, or left in the shadows while others were celebrated. Yet God's gaze is not drawn to outward appearances or societal accolades. As Samuel declared in 1 Samuel 16:7, "For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." This is where we uncover a profound truth about God's orchestration. He often begins his work in places of obscurity. Spurgeon eloquently captured this principle when he wrote, "It is not great talents God blesses so much as great likeness to Christ." In the quiet fields, David was being shaped into the man after God's own heart. His faithfulness in the small, unseen duties, guarding sheep, fending off lions and bears, was preparing him for a far greater calling. Think for a moment of how the modern world glorifies recognition and instant success. Yet God works differently. He molds his instruments in hidden places, refining character and building resilience. David's obscurity was not a curse, but a stage for God's divine preparation. A poignant parallel can be drawn to the life of Joseph, who was cast into a pit by his brothers and later imprisoned unjustly. Like David, Joseph might have seemed forgotten, yet God was orchestrating every moment to prepare him for leadership in Egypt. Both men teach us that the wilderness is not a place of abandonment, but a workshop for greatness. Emotionally, this resonates deeply with the struggles of today. In a culture where self-worth is so often tied to visibility and success, the story of David reminds us that God's favor is not contingent on human acknowledgement. Even when it seems as though no one sees your labor, God sees. He values the heart over the crowd's applause. Perhaps you are in a season of obscurity right now. Maybe your efforts feel unnoticed, your prayers unanswered, your dreams delayed. Hear this. God's favor is not limited by your current circumstances. He is preparing you for something beyond your imagination. Remember the words of Isaiah 49:15-16. Can a woman forget her nursing child? Surely they may forget, yet I will not forget you. See, I've inscribed you on the palms of my hands. God's orchestration often begins in places where we feel most insignificant. Yet it is in those very places that he is at work, weaving a story of purpose and glory. Take heart, dear friends. The same God who chose David from the wilderness is choosing and shaping you, even now. From the wilderness, God began moving David into a position of influence in the most unexpected way. Imagine, if you will, the shepherd boy, accustomed to the solitude of fields and the company of sheep, being summoned to the court of King Saul. The path that led him there was not through conquest or ambition, but through a quiet, humble skill, the playing of his harp. The Bible tells us in 1 Samuel 16:21-22, "So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer." Saul, tormented by an evil spirit, found relief in David's music. Though David's anointing as king had been secret, God was already orchestrating events to prepare him for the throne by placing him in proximity to it. This phase of David's life is a testament to how God uses even the smallest talents and circumstances to position his people for his purposes. Often we are tempted to underestimate the significance of our gifts or assume that our daily tasks have no bearing on God's grand plan. Yet here we see that David's skill with the harp, likely honed during quiet hours in the field, became the very avenue through which God opened doors. Spurgeon, reflecting on God's providence, once said, "We are perhaps too prone to arrange the Almighty's plans for him, and we find ourselves hampered by our narrow notions. God's ways are higher than ours, and he accomplishes his ends by methods we could never conceive." How true this is in David's life. Who could have predicted that playing music would be his first step into the royal court? For us today, this speaks to the power of faithfulness in the little things. Perhaps you feel as though your work, skills, or contributions are insignificant. Yet just as God used David's harp to pave the way for his future, he can use the seemingly mundane aspects of your life to fulfill his purposes. Colossians 3:23 reminds us, "And whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men." Let me illustrate with a modern parallel. There are countless stories of individuals who, through seemingly small acts of service or unnoticed talents, found themselves in positions of extraordinary impact. Consider the teacher who patiently invests in a struggling student, not knowing that their encouragement might shape the future leader of a nation. Or the nurse who offers a kind word to a patient, unwittingly inspiring a legacy of compassion. David's entrance into Saul's court also highlights the theme of God's preparation through exposure. Before David could rule, he needed to observe the dynamics of leadership. God placed him in the king's house, not just to serve, but to learn. Even as Saul's servant, David was being prepared for his future role. Emotionally, this touches a deep nerve in today's culture. Many feel trapped in positions that seem to lack purpose or significance. Yet David's story reminds us that God's plans often unfold in layers. What seems like a detour may be a divine setup. What feels like a delay may be God's deliberate timing to equip you for something greater. Take comfort, dear listener, in this truth. God is using every moment, your gifts, your struggles, your circumstances, to weave his perfect plan. Even now, he is orchestrating connections and opportunities that you cannot yet see. Trust him, for his ways are always good. We now turn to one of the most iconic moments in David's life, his confrontation with Goliath, the Philistine giant. The story, found in 1 Samuel 17, is more than a tale of courage. It is a testament to how God empowers the seemingly powerless to achieve his purposes. This event is a divine orchestration, revealing how God transforms ordinary people into instruments of extraordinary victory. Picture the scene. The armies of Israel cower in fear as Goliath, a warrior of colossal stature, mocks and taunts them. For 40 days, the Israelites are paralyzed, unable to act. Into this charged atmosphere steps David, a young shepherd bringing provisions to his brothers. What audacity for a boy to even consider facing a seasoned giant. Yet, David's confidence was not in his own strength, but in the name of the Lord. As he declares in 1 Samuel 17:45, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Here, David's faith shines brightly, illuminating a profound truth. The battles we face are not ours to fight alone. They belong to the Lord. Let us pause and reflect on the giants we face in our own lives. In today's world, these giants may take the form of fear, financial hardship, addiction, illness, or broken relationships. The enormity of these challenges often leaves us feeling small and ill-equipped, much like the Israelites before Goliath. But David's story reminds us that the size of the opposition is irrelevant when compared to the power of our God. Spurgeon once wrote, "Great faith brings great triumphs." David's faith was not rooted in his abilities, but in his absolute trust in God's sovereignty. He had seen God's deliverance before, in the wilderness when he faced lions and bears, and this past faithfulness fueled his present confidence. This principle applies directly to our lives. Often, God uses our smaller battles to prepare us for greater victories. The lions and bears you face today are not random. They are training ground for the giants of tomorrow. Each trial strengthens your faith, sharpens your skills, and deepens your reliance on God. In modern terms, consider how adversity often serves as a catalyst for growth. A woman battling cancer may emerge with a testimony of God's sustaining grace, inspiring others to trust Him. A man recovering from addiction may become a beacon of hope for those still struggling. These victories are not the result of human strength, but of God's power working through weakness. The battlefield with Goliath was not just about military victory. It was about glorifying God before all who witnessed. As David declared in 1 Samuel 17:46, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Our personal battles, too, have the potential to become platforms for God's glory. David's story stirs us emotionally because it taps into our universal desire to overcome. In a culture where so many feel overwhelmed by the giants of life, this account offers hope. It assures us that with God, no obstacle is insurmountable. This lesson, however, cannot be learned from afar. It requires stepping onto the battlefield, armed not with worldly weapons but with faith. David carried a sling and 5 smooth stones, not because they were formidable, but because they were what God had provided. In the same way, God equips us with what we need, even if it seems insufficient in human eyes. As we return to the battlefield, we see David standing alone before Goliath, his faith unwavering. The young shepherd's confidence was not a reckless boldness, but a deep conviction born of his relationship with God. When Goliath mocked him, David's response was simple and profound. He trusted in the living God to deliver victory. It's striking to note that David's weapon, a sling and a stone, seemed utterly inadequate against the giant. Goliath was clad in armor, wielding weapons of war, while David carried tools of a shepherd. Yet, this contrast underscores a powerful principle. God often uses what the world deems weak or foolish to confound the mighty. As 1 Corinthians 1:7 reminds us, "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty." In this moment, David embodied the truth that victory comes not from human might, but from reliance on God. When the stone left David's sling and struck Goliath's forehead, it wasn't merely physics at work, it was the hand of God directing that stone with perfect precision. The giant fell, and Israel's army erupted in triumph, not because of their strength, but because one boy trusted in the Lord. Let us now reflect on how this applies to the giants in our lives. Spurgeon eloquently said, "God helps those who cannot help themselves." This does not mean we are passive in our struggles, rather it means that our reliance is on God's power rather than our own. The giants we face may seem insurmountable, but they are no match for the God who is for us. Take heart, dear listener. The tools God has placed in your hands, whether they seem ordinary or unfit, are more than enough when wielded in faith. The prayers you pray, the acts of kindness you extend, the words of encouragement you speak, these are your stones and sling. Think also of how David's victory inspired a ripple effect. When the army of Israel saw Goliath defeated, their fear turned to boldness and they pursued the Philistines with newfound courage. Your faith, too, has the power to inspire others. When you overcome your giants, you bear witness to the faithfulness of God and encourage those around you to trust Him as well. Emotionally, this story speaks to the core of our human experience. So many feel ill-equipped to face the challenges before them, burdened by their own inadequacies. Yet David's triumph reminds us that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Beloved friends, do not despise the battles you face. Though they may seem overwhelming, they are opportunities for God to display His glory. Stand firm, as David did, knowing that the God who delivered him from the lion, the bear, and the giant is the same God who fights for you. As we now trace the arc of David's life, we arrive at the pinnacle of his story, his rise to the throne. It is a tale woven with divine precision, demonstrating how God orchestrates every detail to fulfill His purpose. From the obscurity of the pasture to the grandeur of the palace, David's journey to kingship is not merely a story of elevation, but a testament to God's unwavering faithfulness. Though David was anointed as king in his youth, 1 Samuel 16:13, the path to the throne was far from immediate or straightforward. After his victory over Goliath, one might expect his ascent to be swift and uncontested. Yet, as we often see in God's work, the fulfillment of His promises involves seasons of waiting, trials, and preparation. David's years on the run from Saul, his time living among enemies, and the battles he fought were not detours but deliberate steps in God's plan. This phase of David's life resonates deeply with our own experiences of delay and difficulty. How often do we, like David, wonder why the fulfillment of God's promises seems so distant? Yet it is in these very seasons of uncertainty that God is at work, refining our character and deepening our dependence on Him. Spurgeon, with his characteristic insight, wrote, "The Lord gets His best soldiers out of the highlands of affliction." David's trials were not wasted. They were the furnace in which God forged a king. His time in the wilderness taught him to lead with humility, to trust God implicitly, and to rely on His guidance in every decision. For us, this principle is both challenging and comforting. It is challenging because it reminds us that God's timeline often differs from our own. It is comforting because it assures us that God's delays are never denials. He is always working for our good, even when His hand seems hidden. Consider Psalm 27:14, a psalm attributed to David, where he writes, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and He shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." These words were not penned in the comfort of the palace, but in the crucible of hardship, reflecting the deep trust David had in God's timing. Emotionally, David's journey speaks to the heart of those who feel stuck between a promise and its fulfillment. In a world that prizes instant results, the idea of waiting can feel unbearable. Yet David's story reminds us that the waiting season is not a wasted season. It is where God prepares us for the weight of His promises. David's journey to the throne also highlights the principle of servanthood before leadership. Even as he waited for God's promise to unfold, he served faithfully, whether playing the harp for Saul, leading his band of men in the wilderness, or sparing Saul's life when he had the opportunity to take it. This humility and patience reveal the heart of a true leader, one shaped by God's hand. As we delve further into David's journey, we see a man whose life was marked by faith and obedience, even in the face of prolonged trials. Though anointed as king, David did not seize the throne by force. Instead, he waited for God to establish him in His perfect time. This restraint speaks volumes about David's trust in God's sovereignty. On 2 occasions, David had the chance to kill Saul and claim the throne for himself, 1 Samuel 24 and 1 Samuel 26. Both times he refused, declaring, "The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed." 1 Samuel 24:6. These moments reveal David's deep respect for God's authority and His timing. David understood that the throne was not his to take, but God's to give. This principle holds profound relevance for us today. In a culture that often values ambition over submission, David's restraint is a powerful reminder to trust God's process. How tempting it is to take matters into our own hands when God's promises seem delayed. Yet David's example encourages us to rest in the assurance that God's plans are always worth waiting for. Spurgeon captured this beautifully when he wrote, "To wait is hard, to do it with grace is harder. The Lord does not tarry arbitrarily, but for our profit." David's willingness to wait with grace was not born out of passivity, but out of a deep belief that God's purposes would prevail. In addition to waiting, David demonstrated extraordinary perseverance. After Saul's death, David was anointed king over Judah, 2 Samuel 2:4, but still faced opposition from Saul's remaining house. It took 7 more years before he was anointed king over all Israel. These years were filled with conflict and challenges, yet David remained steadfast, trusting God to bring his promises to fruition. This steadfastness mirrors the perseverance required of us in our own spiritual journeys. Often God's promises unfold in stages, each step preparing us for the next. The process may be slow, but it is never aimless. Every trial, every delay, every obstacle is part of God's divine orchestration. The emotional depth of David's story is especially poignant when we consider the human longing for recognition and fulfillment. In today's world, where success is often equated with speed and visibility, David's patience and humility stand as a countercultural example. His life reminds us that true greatness is not achieved through self-promotion, but through faithful obedience to God. When David finally ascended to the throne, it was not merely the fulfillment of a personal dream, but the realization of God's covenant promises to his people. As 2 Samuel 7:8-9 recounts, God said to David, "I took you from the sheepfold, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel, and I have been with you wherever you have gone." David's kingship was not the result of human ambition, but of divine appointment. His story is a powerful reminder that God's plans for us are always greater than we can imagine. As Jeremiah 29:11 assures us, "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." As we conclude this point, take heart in the knowledge that God is working all things together for your good. Just as he faithfully guided David from the pasture to the palace, he is faithfully orchestrating every detail of your life for his glory and your ultimate joy. Let us now draw the threads of David's story together as we reflect on the overarching message of God's favor at work. As we gather the strands of David's remarkable journey, we see a story that is not merely about a shepherd becoming a king, but about the unwavering faithfulness of God. David's life is a tapestry woven with divine favor, each thread reflecting God's power to orchestrate all things for good. From the unnoticed boy in the fields to the celebrated king of Israel, David's story testifies to God's ability to take the humble and lift them to unimaginable heights. This divine orchestration begins with the anointing of David in 1 Samuel 16:7, where God reminds Samuel, "For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." It is a profound truth. God's favor is not determined by our status, abilities, or appearance, but by the posture of our hearts. The favor of God is not a promise of an easy life, but a guarantee of his presence and purpose in every season. David experienced this favor in the pasture as he faithfully tended sheep, in the battlefield as he defeated Goliath, in the wilderness as he fled from Saul, and in the palace as he ruled Israel. Each moment, whether triumphant or trying, was part of God's grand design. Spurgeon beautifully articulated this truth, saying, "The providence of God is the great protector of our lives and the sure compass of our paths." David's life exemplifies how God's providence turns every circumstance, whether joyous or painful, into an instrument of his glory. For us, the story of David resonates deeply because it speaks to our longing for purpose and assurance. In a world filled with uncertainty, the promise of Romans 8:28 offers profound comfort, and we know that all things work together for good, to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. David's journey also underscores the necessity of faith. It is faith that allows us to trust in God's timing, faith that sustains us through trials, and faith that enables us to see his hand at work in the ordinary moments of life. Emotionally, David's story assures us that we are never forgotten. Just as God saw David in the wilderness, he sees you in your present circumstances. Whether you feel overlooked, overwhelmed, or outmatched, his favor is upon you. The same God who guided David's steps is guiding yours, orchestrating every detail for your ultimate good. As we reflect on David's life, let us be encouraged to trust in God's sovereignty, to embrace his timing, and to walk in faith, knowing that he is working all things together for our good. May David's story inspire us to live with confidence in the God who transforms shepherds into kings and turns our trials into triumphs. Let us close with a final reminder from Spurgeon. God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. This, beloved friends, is the enduring message of David's life, that God's heart is always for his people, and his favor is unshakable. Trust him and watch as he weaves your story into a masterpiece of grace and glory. As we bring this message to its conclusion, let us stand in awe of the intricate ways God orchestrates our lives. Just as David's story reveals the unfathomable wisdom and loving care of our God, so too does our own journey reflect his handiwork. Though the paths he takes us on may seem winding, though the trials may appear insurmountable, his plans are always perfect. Consider the psalmist's words in Psalm 37, 23-24. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. David lived this truth, and so can we. His life reminds us that even when we cannot see the full picture, we can trust the one who holds the brush. Spurgeon's reflections often draw us back to the comfort of God's sovereignty. He once wrote, "When we cannot see the way, let us trust the guide." In David's life, we see a vivid example of this trust. Whether in the wilderness or the throne room, his reliance on God never wavered. In our modern context, this message is profoundly relevant. Many of us feel the weight of disappointment, the sting of failure, or the frustration of delay. Yet David's story offers hope. It reminds us that God's favor does not exempt us from hardship, but transforms those hardships into stepping stones toward his greater purpose. Let this truth resonate deeply within your soul. You are not forgotten. The same God who called David from the pasture knows your name. He sees your struggles, your tears, your victories, and your dreams. And he is working, even now, to bring about his plans for your life. Practically, this means surrendering our plans to him, seeking his guidance in prayer, and walking in faith, even when the road is unclear. It means trusting that the trials we endure today are the tools he uses to shape us into the people he has called us to be. As we leave this moment of reflection, let us take with us the assurance that God is for us. Just as he orchestrated every detail of David's life for good, he is orchestrating yours. Rest in his promises, walk in his favor, and live with the confidence that the God who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Philippians 1:6. Beloved, trust the conductor of your symphony. Though the melody may not yet make sense, the harmonies of his grace are weaving a masterpiece that will resound for eternity. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may his favor rest upon you always. Amen.